Most gardeners are taught to pile compost on the surface and wait, but that approach leaves an enormous amount of soil power untapped. If you're serious about growing stronger plants with less effort, this one shift changes everything. Before we get into it, make sure you subscribe to the Evergreen Garden channel and drop a comment letting me know what you currently do with your compost scraps, because this method works whether you're growing in beds, rows, or containers, and it keeps paying off year after year. Why burying compost scraps works with soil biology instead of against it. Soil is not a passive medium. It is a living system built around fungi, bacteria, worms, and microorganisms that thrive below the surface, not on top of it. When compost scraps sit on the surface, they dry out, lose nitrogen to the air, attract pests, and break down slowly. When those same scraps are buried, even shallowly, they enter the active zone where soil life is already working. Microbes immediately colonize the material, worms pull it deeper, and nutrients are released exactly where plant roots can access them. This is not theory, it's how forests feed themselves without compost piles. Why surface piles waste nutrients gardeners work hard to create. Anytime organic matter is left exposed, nitrogen volatilizes and carbon oxidizes. That means the fertility you thought you were adding literally disappears into the air. Rain also washes soluble nutrients away before roots ever touch them. Buried scraps are protected from sun, wind, and runoff. A simple test proves this. Bury vegetable scraps 6 inches deep in one bed and leave the same amount on the surface of another bed. Within 3 weeks, the buried scraps will be mostly gone and the soil darker, looser, and alive, while the surface pile will still be visible, dry, and unevenly broken down. How buried compost feeds plants faster and more evenly. Roots do not grow upward to chase surface nutrients. They grow outward and downward, following moisture and microbial signals. When compost scraps are buried along planting rows or around root zones, nutrients are released slowly and consistently. For heavy feeders like tomatoes, maize, squash, or bananas, burying compost creates a steady underground buffet. A practical ratio that works well is 1 part kitchen scraps to 2 parts soil by volume when burying in trenches. For example, a 10-foot tomato row can take about 1 bucket of chopped scraps buried 6 to 8 inches deep and covered well. Plants grown this way show deeper green leaves, thicker stems, and less stress during dry periods. So here's why burying compost, really helps eliminate pests, odors, and all that mess. When you leave compost on the surface, it tends to attract rodents, flies, dogs, and other scavengers. But buried compost, it just doesn't have that problem. Once you cover your scraps with soil, the oxygen levels drop just enough to discourage any nasty smells, but still allow for aerobic decomposition. Plus, this method prevents fruit flies and ants from finding your food scraps. If you've ever stopped composting because of smell or animals, honestly, burying your scraps solves that problem completely. Even in urban gardens, this method stays clean and discreet. So, let's talk about how to bury compost scraps correctly without harming your plants. The key here is, depth, spacing, and balance. Fresh scraps should always be buried at least 6 inches deep, and you should never place them directly against plant stems. For existing plants, it's best to dig a narrow trench halfway between the plants or just outside the drip line. If you're working with new beds, bury your scraps first, then plant above them after you've covered everything with soil. Oh, and do avoid burying large amounts of woody material or oily food. Chopping your scraps into smaller pieces will really help speed up the breakdown process. As a safe general rule, try not to bury more than 1 inch thick of scraps in any single layer before covering with soil. This helps prevent anaerobic rot. Now, why does this method build soil structure in the long term? Well, as those buried scraps decompose, they leave behind channels that improve both aeration and water infiltration, Worm tunnels, believe it or not, act like underground irrigation lines, carrying moisture deep into the soil profile. Over time, even compacted soil becomes crumbly and resilient. That's why gardeners who bury compost notice fewer problems with things like crusting, runoff, and root restriction, sometimes after just one season. So you're not just feeding your plants, you're actually rebuilding the architecture of your soil. You might be wondering how burying compost fits into no-dig and low-effort gardening. Well, burying compost doesn't require you to turn over entire beds or manage big piles. It works with minimal disturbance and fits naturally into no-dig systems. Gardeners can rotate burial zones each season, which allows soil life to regenerate continuously. In dry climates, this method is especially useful, as it dramatically improves moisture retention. Organic matter stays hydrated underground, instead of drying out on the surface. And, well, this is why serious gardeners eventually abandon surface piles. Once you see how quickly buried scraps disappear and how your plants respond, surface composting starts to feel a bit inefficient. Burying compost mimics natural ecosystems, protects nutrients, reduces labor, and produces visible results. It really does turn kitchen waste into a direct investment in your soil rather than a waiting game. So, if you want healthier soil, stronger plants, and fewer problems without extra work, just start burying your compost scraps and let the soil do what it's designed to do. Subscribe to Evergreen Garden for more practical, proven gardening strategies. Share this with another gardener who's still piling compost on the surface, and leave a comment telling me what crops you're going to try this method on first.